This conversation with Dennis Cawthorne is part of the James J. Blanchard Living Library of Michigan Political History, a project of the Michigan Political History Society. We have with us here today Dennis Cawthorne, former State House of Representatives Republican leader, later prominent lawyer lobbyist, longtime chairman of the Mackinac Island Park Commission. I am Bill Ballinger, publisher of the digital newsletter, theballingerreport.com. I want to start out, Dennis Cawthorne, by welcoming you to this particular interview.
Thank you, Bill.
Observe that I think you are a native of Manistee, Michigan, on the shores of Lake Michigan, if I'm not mistaken.
That's
and
correct.
You were born and brought up there, and I think both sides of your family, your mother's and father's side, have been up in that area since the 19th century. Were they political junkies?
No, they weren't. Now, my father, however, was always very civic-minded, and in 1946, as a matter of fact, the local Democratic Party tried to convince him to run for the state house, but he didn't do it, which was a good thing because, as all Michigan political historians know, 1946 was the first Republican wave since the Depression, and in the state house it was 95-5 Republican and 32-2 in the Senate afterward. So he didn't run, but I got my interest in politics by being, believe it or not, a newspaper delivery boy for the Manistee News Advocate. I would deliver the paper, but in the process of delivering the paper, I would read the front page, which caused me to skip quite a few houses, by the way. But in reading the front page of the paper, I really got fascinated by the political stories. And when I was in third grade, I found a book on the presidents, and I had that book at my desk, all that school year. So when the school year ended, the teacher said, "You may as well take this book and keep it as your own." And I have it to this day. And then in another example of a misspent youth, I, at that age, which was about 9 or 10, also started reading the Michigan manuals. So I got totally engrossed in politics, and particularly Michigan politics.
Wow, you were born in 1940, so we're talking about 1950 when you hit your stride here, getting inculcated in political wisdom. So what happened after that? You had the Eisenhower election coming up in 1952?
Well, I got really pumped up in advance of the Eisenhower election, and I formed a Young People for Eisenhower Club in Manistee, and we got a lot of publicity for the club. Picture appeared in the front page of the Grand Rapids Press and various other, and Grand Rapids Herald and other papers. And I guess the highlight of it all was when I actually got a hand-signed, personally signed letter from Ike thanking me for my endeavors. So by this time now I'm really pumped up. And of course he won the election, and we were very, very pleased by that. I didn't get invited to that inauguration, but 4 years later when he was reelected, I also got an invitation to the inaugural, which at that time really was sort of a special thing. Now they go out en masse, but back in those days it was kind of unusual for particularly a 16-year-old kid to get an invitation to the inaugural.
Absolutely. What about that 1956 election? There were a lot of things going on in that election, weren't there?
Well, that was a big year for, I guess, me personally in terms of my future. What happened was, in the 9th Congressional District, which was western Michigan from Muskegon up through Grand Traverse, the incumbent member of Congress was Ruth Thompson. And Ruth Thompson was the first woman elected to Congress from Michigan. And a lot of people have always assumed it was Martha Griffiths. No, it was Ruth Thompson, a rather conservative Republican female from western Michigan, who was number one. Well, Ruth Thompson had very foolishly, I guess might be the right word, gotten in the middle of a big dispute among the communities in northern Michigan as to who would be awarded a jet air base. Now, these days, most communities would probably run the other direction if they were offered a jet air base. But in the 1950s, in the Traverse City, Cadillac, Manistee area, it was a big deal because they saw it as potentially a big economic boon. Well, anyway, Ms. Thompson got on the wrong side of the issue. Many of the communities were ticked off. Manistee was the one community that she did not tick off. Bob Griffin, a young Traverse City attorney, ran against her in the primary. I actually worked on Miss Thompson's campaign. She got creamed in the primary everywhere except Manistee County, where she won handily. So after that primary election, I wrote Bob Griffin a letter as a 16-year-old and said, "Hey, the primary is over. I'd be glad to work for you." And in those days, there weren't volunteers on the ground, at least in rural areas. So I was literally a one-man team for Bob Griffin in Manistee County. And just before the election of 1956, I wrote him a letter and I said, "I've been out doing this, this, and this, and I predict you're going to carry this county by 300 votes." Well, when he got the letter, he chuckled and said, "Well, this young man is, very nice. We appreciate all his work, but we're going to get creamed there." Well, he carried Manistee County by 325 votes.
Wow.
and the next spring, he came to me and asked me if I'd like to work for a summer in Washington. Well, would I?
Yeah.
So
You were like between your junior and senior year in high school.
that's
at that
correct.
point. Yeah.
That's correct. And one of the interesting things was, these days Washington is awash in interns. I mean,
Right.
on Capitol Hill are interns everywhere. But I was told when I came to Washington in that summer of 1957 that there's only one other young intern in a congressional office. And I believe that was probably true. So I really had an unusual opportunity. And that summer I had a chance to meet Richard Nixon, and we did a TV show together. I met LBJ, JFK.
Wow.
And one of the interesting things was I was invited to go with Bob Griffin to the Pentagon to meet with the Assistant Secretary of Defense. Now these days, you couldn't.
Yeah.
That would never happen.
Yes.
But that was another memorable occasion for that summer of 1957.
What did you do for housing down there?
Well, I lived with the Griffin family for the first 3 weeks of my time there, so I got to know and babysit actually part-time.
This is unbelievable.
For future federal judge Richard Griffin. And
Yes, yeah.
so that was a great time. Then after that, I lived on my own as a 17-year-old in Washington, something else that I'm not sure these days that would happen. So I really had a chance to spread my wings and learn about the ways of the world.
Well, so you got back to Manistee for your senior year. It must have seemed pretty placid stuff at that point compared to what you'd experienced in the summer of 1957, right?
Well, that's true, but then Bob Griffin contacted me the following spring and said, "Would you like to come back?" And so I went back to Washington in the spring of 1958, and that was the year that he was beginning to really tune up the Lander-Griffin bill, which is a landmark piece of legislation to rein in union excesses.
Right.
So, I had some tangential involvement in that.
Right. Did he have any recommendation for you as to your educational direction at that point? You were getting out of high school. Where were you going to go?
As a matter of fact, he did play a big role in that because he recommended to me that I attend a small liberal arts school. He thought that was the best thing to do, particularly if later on I was going to go to grad school like a law school.
Right.
So one of the places he recommended was Albion, and so I got kind of fascinated with it, and I went there, and it was a very wise decision as it turned out.
And then after that, what happened? And by the way, while you were at Albion, that was the election of 1960, Kennedy versus Nixon, whom
Yes.
you had met
Yes.
3 years before.
Yes.
Did you have any role in that campaign? Did you do anything up in Manistee or down in Albion or what?
Yes, as a matter of fact, at Albion, we kind of restarted the College of Republicans there, and so John F. Kennedy came through Albion on a campaign train express, and they stopped in Albion, and he was talking to the great crowd about missile gap, which was
Right.
a big issue of
Big
his,
issue.
which
Yeah.
later on I think has been pretty much debunked as being legitimate, but was a big issue in '60.
Right.
Well, he said something about the missile gap, and this is really crazy. The crowd happened to go silent just at that moment, and I don't think I'm a big mouth, but I said from the crowd, all a matter of statistics. And he said, "No, young man, it is not just a matter of statistics." So I actually had an interchange, totally unplanned.
A public debate.
Yeah, with JFK, totally unplanned.
Unbelievable.
And anyway, so that was quite a memorable occasion. And the Albion campus, by the way, went 8-1 for Nixon over Kennedy. It had nothing to do with our campaign.
I
but
doubt if the margin would have been those proportions nowadays
they would not
with
be.
the student bodies.
Things
we
are
have.
very different.
Yeah.
Things